Good evening, everyone. I'm Maureen Aylward, the Executive Director of TownGreen, and welcome to the TownGreen Planning for Reality series. This evening, we are going to be focusing on Manchester by the Sea. We're going to be looking at sea level rise and flooding at Masconomo Park, Singing Beach, and the downtown area. Just to note that we do have a field trip this Friday, April 5th, 3 to 4 p.m., guided by Salem Sound Coast Watch. We will have Barbara Warren guiding us for the field trip, and we're going to meet in Masconomo Park. This evening's panel includes Sarah Page, Dr. Jayne Knott, and Greg Federspiel. I'm going to introduce them, and then we're going to get into the program. Sarah Page is a research associate for Harvard University Graduate School of Design's Office for Urbanization, and she's the Trucker Traveling Fellow at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. Sarah's research focuses on regional planning and the design of built environment across multiple scales of community. We're really pleased to have Sarah here this evening. And just a note that Professor Charles Waldheim is not able to make it this evening. Dr. Jayne Knott is the founder and president of HydroPredictions, an environmental consulting firm specializing in groundwater hydrology, groundwater remediation, and climate change adaptation. Jayne has authored several scientific journal articles on climate change adaptation for coastal road infrastructure and on the impacts of climate change on water resources. She is on TownGreen's board of directors and the Charles River Watersheds Board of Advisors. She holds a PhD in civil and environmental engineering from the University of New Hampshire and a master's in civil and environmental engineering from MIT. Greg Federspiel is the town administrator for the town of Manchester by the Sea. He is also on the board of directors for TownGreen. Greg has been instrumental in spearheading coastal resilience projects, as well as finding funding opportunities to support these projects. He is a member of the steering committee working with the Harvard Graduate School of Design's Office for Urbanization on an ongoing Case for Cape Ann study. Welcome to our panelists. And Sarah, you're up.
Thank you so much, Maureen. And thank you for the generous introduction. And I'm sorry again that Charles can't be with us, but we appreciate being here nonetheless. So I'm excited to get started. We go ahead and go next, Jayne, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I'm trying to move it forward. It may take a minute.
No worries.
I might also add before Sarah gets started that we will have Q&A after the panel.
Let's try it again. There we go.
That's perfect, Jayne.
Okay.
Appreciate it. So I'll go ahead and get started by introducing a little bit about us. So the Office for Urbanization is a design research office at Harvard's University's Graduate School of Design. And the office does scenario planning work through sponsored design research projects. So next. And as was mentioned before, we are currently working on a multi-year project with the generous support of TownGreen, Water Alliance, and the Cape Ann Coalition to understand how climates and landscapes are already changing on Cape Ann, and they're going to continue to change in the future. So next. So we really conduct this analysis through scenario planning, which is a methodology to come up with plausible but not probable images of the future. So our goal is in imagining these future scenarios is to allow stakeholders and decision makers like yourselves to make decisions in the present. Next. And so as I mentioned, we've gone through multiple phases of work. So the first focuses on building scenarios which are centered around a future storm event, while the second examines Cape Ann's ecological systems more broadly. And then we are currently beginning phase 3, which focuses on developing local capacity to manage these changes through governance, finance, and community engagement. So next. So within phase 1, we focused on two scenarios and then two studies. So scenario 1 is looking at the Great Storm of 2038, which evaluates the cost of doing nothing. It imagines if a middle of the road Category 3 hurricane struck Cape Ann in 2038. And then scenario 1 suggests potential adaptation measures and is followed by 2 additional studies. Next. So we're going to start by focusing on scenario 0, where we modeled a storm that we call the Great Storm of 2038, which is really named after the hurricane of 1938. And we imagine this storm as a projected future extreme weather event, and we visualize it through different media, including rendered images and animations. But through these visualizations, our goal, as I said, is for stakeholders to be able to be immersed in this plausible future and to explore issues and uncertainties that you might not think of immediately when imagining a hurricane on Cape Ann. So next. So this imagined storm of 2038 strikes 100 years after the Great New England Hurricane, which devastated the region almost a century ago. Next. So the Great Storm forms across the Atlantic in 2038 and then approaches the coast of the US. Next. And the storm would then hit Cape Ann on September 2nd, the Thursday before Labor Day weekend. Next. And so this animation shows the barometric pressure, the storm surge as it increases, as well as changes in temperature, and the rainfall expected, as well as wind speed and direction. And then the news ticker at the bottom of the animation shows what's happening if you're on the ground during the storm, watching television, that highlights impacts on critical infrastructures across Cape Ann. And so one thing also that this simulation shows is that many critical evacuation routes, not only in Manchester, but across Cape Ann, will be impacted over time. And it looks like our video is having a little bit of trouble buffering, but that's okay. We can go ahead and go to the next slide and see Manchester more specifically. We can do next if it will load for us, Jane.
It's not moving ahead.
I gotcha. We might have to escape out of the presentation and come back. Sometimes the videos give a little bit of a trouble. Sorry about that.
Okay, no problem.
But as that's coming up, we might go ahead and zoom into the Manchester slide if it will load for us. And basically within this animation, we zoom in to Manchester and we're able to just see the emergency evacuations that are ordered and how access to power is lost throughout the storm's process. And then we're able to see a little bit of the flooding that's taking place within that specific area.
Okay, just a second.
And we can bypass that slide if it's giving us trouble, Jane. Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
Okay.
For sure. So if the animation's not showing of the flooding, that's fine because Jane's going to talk more about that in her presentation anyways. But so basically we just see that flooding and the floodwaters are going to continue to rise and overtake large areas of the downtown, which we'll get into. But here we have begun to imagine what that looks like specifically from the ground. So one place that we focused on within the research is in Gulf Oil downtown. Which serves as a crucial point on the evacuation route for people on Route 127 and will be congested as flooding begins the morning of the storm. So next. And so during the storm, downtown Manchester will see 10-foot waves flooding the village core. And there are several underground storage tanks that will release hazardous petroleum in the area, which will inevitably rush back into the ocean after the floodwaters recede. Next. So after the storm, the gas station will be a critical place for residents to get gasoline. And as Cape Ann will likely not have power for 2 weeks after the storm, residents will need to rely on emergency generators. They'll become even more important. Next. So one of the longer term effects of the storm is the MBTA bridge, where the entire line is actually extremely vulnerable from North Station, and the berm may erode and collapse. Next. And so throughout the storm, residential destruction will be significant. Next. And the lack of protections that are afforded to critical infrastructures will actually strain search and rescue efforts. Next. But overall, this envisioning of the Great Storm explores the way that 27 critical infrastructures will be impacted across all of Cape Ann, and we can see those here. Next. But the flood projections that were used to model the storm, which we see here, were able to give us information about residential structures as well. Next. And we were able to conclude that there are over 1,000 residential structures and over 3,000 residential partials in the floodplain across Cape Ann. Next. But the information from scenario 0 is not intended to frighten, but to give additional information that highlights future vulnerabilities. And so next, scenario 1 moves beyond scenario 0 and imagines alternative futures based on a menu of potential interventions. So next. So we use the same strategy as scenario planning to walk through different options that inform decision making. So we began this tranche of work by looking at a range of adaptation precedents and literature and found a couple of key takeaways. So next. So here we identified 7 sub-scenarios and investigate different infrastructures, economies, and places across Cape Ann, including downtown Manchester. And each of these sub-scenarios address areas of interest for climate adaptation. Next. And so we're going to start by looking at armoring coastlines and communities as a potential intervention. Next. So in the face of the threats that we saw from the Great Storm, Cape Ann requires coastal armoring infrastructures to continue to protect against flooding. But conventional gray infrastructure like the bulkheads and jetties that are along the Cape now have high maintenance costs and increase erosion and scoring at other locations along the coast. So these types of gray infrastructure should be paired with green infrastructure like restored barrier beaches, dunes, and marshland. Next. But this imagines several great infrastructure projects across Cape Ann that include a storm surge barrier in Manchester, which would protect the harbor, the inner harbor area, but would not protect Singing Beach and the residences along the coast. Next. And so that specific intervention is also paired with the elevation of the MBTA tracks. Next. And so while these combined efforts would protect 106 structures from flooding, at the estimated cost of $32.5 million, several buildings would be effectively totaled, with the cost of their protection exceeding the projected financial value. Next. So in additionally, utilizing gray infrastructure to protect structures from flooding does nothing to really restore Manchester's existing ecological system or prevent ongoing pollution, which we'll talk a little bit more about in the next few slides. So next. So an alternative option is to elevate and relocate key supply systems. So next. So as we saw in the projections, several of the supply systems across Cape Ann are vulnerable to sea level rise and storm surge. Next. Including these electrical infrastructures. So in Manchester, the East Beverly feeder trunk line is at risk, as well as a key substation. Next. And then, as we've mentioned before, the Manchester's wastewater treatment plant is also vulnerable. Next. So there's several interventions that can be utilized to address these vulnerabilities, including buffer, defend, elevate, the doubling up of services, and relocating of assets. But deciding which operation is applicable for each piece of infrastructure requires balancing social, financial, environmental, and even aesthetic choices. Next. So in addition to addressing supply systems, the public realm is also vulnerable. So next. Elevation of the public realm is also just an important option that will protect people from storm surge among a menu of options. Next. But similarly, it will have implications on the character and quality of the village core, as well as financial implications for the municipality, as well as these individual owners. Next. So another option that we'll talk about is accelerating ecological adaptations. Next. And so this really works to enhance green infrastructure and the existing ecosystems. Next. So one of those are Cape Anne's beaches, which are facing several challenges, with some eroding while others are accreting sediment. Next. So interventions which are taken on one beach are going to affect all of the others. So understanding that Singing Beach or any of Manchester's beaches don't operate in isolation, but are interconnected to all the beach systems on Cape Anne and then even within the Gulf of Maine. Next. So a few examples of potential interventions include living breakwaters, constructed dunes, and the enhancement of interconnected wetlands. Next. And then specifically the stabilization of coastal banks. Next. So ultimately, scenario 1 outlines areas of Cape Anne that are vulnerable to the future storm event and then explores potential solutions within these 27 critical infrastructures. Next. So moving from the first phase of work that really focused on the Great Storm, phase 2 moves forward to talk about Cape Anne's landscapes as a whole. Next. So this tranche of work looks at the existing conditions of Cape Anne's ecological systems, including the forest, marsh, and beach landscapes. Next. So in Manchester, forest landscapes are the most dominant, which we can see here in the darker green color, but there are also marsh and beach landscapes along the coast, which we can see in the lighter green and then the tan color. Next. So we'll begin to explore their existing condition by cutting a section from the inner harbor and the village core through to Singing Beach. Next. And so we can see that section here, and then we can begin to zoom into the left side of the image that looks at the village core. Next. So here we can see the evidence of ecological restoration that is going on in Manchester. So one example of that is the Sawmill Brook project, which aims to restore tidal flow and reintroduce saltmarsh species to Central Pond. And yet there's still ecological threats. So one that we've talked about a bit is if Manchester's wastewater treatment plant floods, there will be devastating ecological impacts. Next. So now shifting over to the MBTA commuter rail, we can see that since Manchester was built on these filled wetlands, there are several public spaces that will flood regularly, including the park. That is the point of conversation for the design charrette coming up, which Greg will talk about. But we've also seen evidence of that in some of the photos that were shared before the event. But in addition, we can see that while Manchester by the Sea as a municipality is largely forested, the village core has evidence of heat island effect, where impervious surfaces are causing overheating. So the existing tree inventory is a really valuable resource that can be utilized to enhance urban reforestation efforts, but it also has called to attention the limited lifespan of Norway maples in downtown, which will need to be replaced soon. Next. And then finally, as we have discussed, Singing Beach is an important cultural area and a species habitat that's facing threat due to sea level rise and erosion. Next. But it's important to acknowledge that while all of these individual landscapes are interconnected within Manchester, they're also inextricably tied to the larger conditions on Cape Anne and need to be considered as such. Next. And so we won't get into it tonight, but phase 2 also explores a variety of interventions to address ongoing ecological challenges. Next. And we address a lot of these issues on the website, which there is the URL is in the top corner of the screen, and I can also put that into the chat a little bit later. But next. So we really look forward to progressing the work and hearing from all of you. So thank you so much for the time to share tonight. And I think Jayne's going to share next and talk a little bit more about the flooding precisely.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for that overview. Harvard School of Design has done a lot of great work, not just for Manchester, but for all of Cape Anne. So I highly recommend that you go to the website and take a look at what they've produced. There's a lot of great graphics. So my little part of the presentation here, I'm essentially going to talk about climate risks for coastal infrastructure. And a little bit of background and motivation for this is, as you're all aware, sea levels are likely to rise about a foot by the year 2030, 2 feet by mid-century, and 3 feet by 2775. Or, you know, right before the end of the century. You've probably heard higher numbers than these. These are estimates made by this report that I've referenced here, the GBRAG report. And the key word here is likely. So this is really what we expect, either this or higher. And this is just sea level rise. It's not a storm surge on top of sea level rise. So this is just what we would expect every day, you know, like we do today without a storm. Most vulnerability studies have focused on tidal surface water from sea level rise, but coastal groundwater also rises with sea level rise, and a lot of people don't know that. And so when you hear about putting up barriers to keep the waves out and the seawater out, you've also got to consider that the pressure of rising seas will cause the groundwater behind any seawall to rise as well and get into basements and cause problems for roads. Roads and underground infrastructure, both roads and underground infrastructure have historically assumed that climate-related parameters like long-term temperature or groundwater levels are stationary and don't change with time. This is no longer true. And so a lot of the engineers are coming to climate scientists and saying, what do we design to now? We used to design to the past, what's worked in the past. What do we design to now with this changing climate? You may have heard of the term sunny day flooding, which is really flooding of our landscape without storms, and that's clearly related to sea level rise. This is just, these two curves are just showing the fact that the number of days per year where we're going to get that kind of flooding is increasing substantially. So again, the likely levels of sea level rise in Boston, and I say Boston because we have good records in Boston, but you can assume that they're basically this for Manchester and Gloucester and Cape Ann. I'm going to show you some sea level rise scenarios with 4 feet of sea level rise, which is likely by the end of the century. But also I want you to realize that the 2 feet of sea level rise, which we're expecting by mid-century, plus 2 feet of storm surge will give you the effects of 4 feet of sea level rise, and 4 feet of sea level rise with 2 feet of storm surge, you know, would give you 6 feet. So even though we talk about these dates, we're experiencing flooding from storms that are elevations that are like this. And an example is these historic crests in Boston Harbor. These are recorded by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And number one historic crest of seawater was January 4th in 2018, which was the winter storm Grayson. And number 2 was the storm of 78. If you're old like me, you remember the storm of 78. The young folks might not. But that was a really bad storm. But what's interesting is number 3 and number 4 are recent, you know, 2018. Number 4 was January 13th this year at 14.41 feet. And I think the folks in Manchester saw flooding there. We certainly saw it in Gloucester and Rockport, and the coast of New Hampshire got hit very hard. Hampton Beach had lots of flooding just in January of this year. Now, the 5th highest crest in Boston Harbor was 1987. The 6th was the no-name storm, the perfect storm, a big, big storm, historic. And number 7 is January 10th, that same week, in 2024. So I find it very interesting that the January 13th storm had flooding that was worse than the no-name storm. So, but this is an example of sea level rise. And then you can imagine what it would be like if you had a January 13th high tide and a storm corresponding at this, with that high tide. So I'll focus on coastal roads for a minute, but this really applies to all infrastructure, underground infrastructure like sewer systems, septic systems, sewer pipes, water pipes, utilities. But coastal roads, the damage is caused by frequent freeze and thaw. It's also caused by sea level rise, induced groundwater rise, where the groundwater moves up into the underlying layers and weakens them, and then overtopping of the roads. So as you all are aware, the temperatures are projected to rise over time. This graph is showing 1900 over here and 2100 over here, and you can see that the temperatures are projected to rise for the scenarios, the various scenarios. And there's uncertainty with this, but typically they're rising. And because of the changes in temperature, we're seeing changes in our seasons. And I think everyone on this call has probably noticed how our seasons have changed. This is showing that as the annual average temperature rises, the season length of winter is decreasing substantially. And with 2.5 degrees Celsius of temperature rise, you won't have winter at all. Some would say we didn't have a winter this year. But what happens when you get these freeze-thaw cycles where you get it very cold and then you get your 40 and 50 degree days, and then you get it down below 30 or down below 20, and then you get it up to 50 again, is it's horrible on the pavements. And you may have noticed that there's a lot more potholes around New England, and it's because of this. Sea levels are also projected to rise, as you know. This is the sea level from 1800, 1850, 1900, 1950, pretty stable, pretty stable. But what we see from 2000 to 2100 is huge increases of sea level rise, and they accelerate. So this is what the scientists are warning about. It's not what we've seen in the past. It's different. It's much more substantial. So what does sea level rise look like in Manchester? These are just images that were in the newspaper. So this is the park here. This is Manchester Yacht Club, and some other places that are probably more familiar to you than to me. But this is the January storm, not storm. This was the January flood, the January 13th flood in 2024. So this is today. This is this year. Now, as sea level rises, groundwater also rises. And when groundwater rises beneath roads, these little blue lines here are the water table. And you can see that they're moving up in the base layer of this road. This is a road cross section with the asphalt on the top, and then the base layer, and then the subgrade. And so we've done work to analyze these pavement systems, and as the groundwater rises up beneath pavements, the strength of the road is decreased, and the pavement life drops off. There are some roads that are stronger than others. This road has more layers. This has a pressed gravel layer and a regular gravel layer, and then a sub-base sand. And so this is a more substantial road. And you can see it holds up better than the roads with the thicker asphalt, but less base. So, if you understand what roads will hold up better to to rising groundwater and sea level rise, then you can start to think about how you maintain your roads differently. So this is just a little schematic showing the groundwater moving up into the sublayers of the road. And then the warming temperature also weakens the surface of the road, and you get fatigue cracking, and you also get rutting. So dangers of weakened pavements, this is really hits home. So many times when we have storms and flooding, it's the emergency vehicles that have to go out and rescue somebody. And if they're driving over a road that has recently been flooded or that's been sitting in groundwater, that road, which was designed to hold the weight of trucks, no longer can do that. So what can we do to protect the downtown of Manchester and its infrastructure? Greg, I think, is going to talk about that. They've done some wonderful work in Manchester and planning ahead and thinking ahead. But one thing is to find places to store water. You can do this using nature-based solutions or parks as flood storage areas. I think we'll hear more about that. I mentioned briefly about different maintenance practices for your roads and pavements. One thing's for sure is that if you have a damaged road, you don't rebuild it the same as you did before. You have to take into account the fact that these roads are facing the forces of nature now, flooding and rising groundwater, which is weakening them. So barriers, you consider barriers, as Sarah mentioned, some tide gates and storm surge gates. Manchester is uniquely, the geometry of Manchester Harbor is unique in that it has a small entranceway. The inner harbor also has a small entranceway, and so it's a good candidate for these. Raising roads is always very difficult, raising railroad tracks, and then of course you can abandon the roads that flood rather than repairing them constantly, and the rail service, but nobody really wants to do that. This is just a little thing on informed pavement maintenance. The thing I want you to remember from this is that pavement management without considering climate change is the most costly option, always. To rebuild roads the way you've been doing it in the past, coastal roads, is the most costly option. But if you can follow a stepwise and flexible adaptation framework, that is the least costly option. So now I'm going to drop out of this PowerPoint and just go to another screen that I have to show you some sea level rise. If you bear with me for a second. That is not it. Hang on. Here it is. You can't see this, correct?
Not yet.
Now you can?
Yes.
Okay, great. So this is Manchester Harbor, and this is just at a regular high tide. The red lines are showing major roads. The pink, fuchsia color is other roads. It's obviously not showing all of the roads, but it gives you an idea of the important roads in Manchester. This line here is the train, the railroad tracks. This is the inner harbor. And this is the outer harbor. And so we saw the flooding over here. This is the Manchester Yacht Club. This is the park. The sewage treatment plant is right here. And correct me if I'm wrong about these things, Greg. please.
Doing well.
But so this is just regular high tide. Now I'm going to add 4 feet of sea level rise to it. And so you can see the dark water is the high tide, and then the lighter blue colors is the additional flooding. So I can go back and forth with this a little bit. And you can see that the park is flooding. You can see that you've got some flooding, overtopping of the roads and stuff around the sewage treatment plant. You see flooding in this area. This is Sawmill Brook, Creek. But whoops. We can also zoom in, and during question and answer, we can zoom in as well. But take a look at some of these roads. So this is a road.
Beach Street.
This is Beach.
Yeah, that's Beach Street. Yeah.
Right? And you can see the blue is over the pink road. So that's showing inundation. You can see inundation of a road over here. You can see some problems over here. This is the
Town Hall.
police town hall. Where's the
Yeah.
police station?
At Town Hall. Yeah.
At town hall. Okay. And you see some flooding up here. Now, if we go to 6 feet of sea level rise, again, we can go back and forth. That's 4. This is 6, 4, 6. So you're seeing more roads impacted, more houses impacted, houses over here. So the downtown is very vulnerable. This whole area here, which is the sewage treatment plant, is underwater. The park is underwater. This is Reed Park, that's underwater. Whoever lives out here, they lost their access a while ago. So these are, and I want to emphasize that these images do not take into account storm surge. So this is just this 4 feet of sea level rise is what we expect every day at high tide toward the end of the century, if the projections are right. And these projections that I'm using are the likely projections. So if Antarctica starts to break down quicker than we think today, it's going to be worse. But this is what you can, this is the minimum that you can plan for. And you should really plan for more. Typically communities are planning for 6, which is this view. Down here in the corner, where if you can see my cursor, that's Singing Beach. So we can go back to just regular high tide. You see a nice big expansion of the beach, even at high tide. At 4 feet, you're seeing much less. At 6 feet, it's just a tiny piece of sand. But what's important here is that as the sea levels rise, it affects the beach. So you get more beach erosion. And so it's not going to look exactly the way it does today. It'll probably, the beach will probably go away a lot quicker than what this is showing. So that's it for me. We can go back to this in the question and answer if you want. But I just wanted to give you a sense of that. Now I'm going to hand it over to Greg.
All right. Well, thank you, Jayne.
Hang on a second.
Yeah.
Let me see if I can pull up the right screen for you.
Sure. What you left off with was a great segue into what I want to focus on.
Okay, great.
Which is our sort of village core area.
There you go. All right.
So what I wanted to spend a few minutes on as we wrap up the more formal portion, and anxious to get to just sort of a dialogue with folks who are viewing and joining us this evening. So thank you for that. Really want to give a high level view of the vulnerability action plan that the community was able to develop in 22 and 23. We were able to secure a grant from Coastal Zone Management from the state and hired a consulting firm, Fuss and O'Neill, to help us put together an action plan focused on the village core and the inner harbor area and some of the flooding that Jayne was just projecting with those shots that she showed us. So I'm going to I strongly encourage people to take a look at this plan. It is on our website. It's a very graphic intensive plan and it has a tremendous amount of data that was collected and compiled in a comprehensive report. Proud to say that it was an award-winning report in the state, and it was recognized for the amount of detail that was put in and just the layout and the graphics that are provided. So to jump to the recommended action plan, so it looks at short, medium, and long-term projects that could be implemented to help us be more resilient to the rising seas that are coming and that we already have seen in some instances. And so in the short term, this graphic is showing us a number of different approaches focusing on sort of building by building floodproofing efforts, sealing up vulnerable entranceways, either garage doors or entrance doorways, elevating electrical connections and generators that people may have. So a series of relatively small steps that help us in storms to maintain the function of the building, and are again sort of the low-hanging fruit, if you will, that could help prolong the use of various buildings. And again, focusing on some of the town facilities. You can see in pink there, Town Hall. Again, putting some sort of a water barrier on the parking lot side where those waters rise, protecting some of the entrances, the police garage door, for example, perhaps gets replaced with a more permanent structure that's no longer as a garage to keep the water out, and those lower doors being reinforced and become waterproof. Similar at the water plant where you see in the blue there that Jayne had indicated before, raising up the various mechanical functions of the plant and a relatively low line barrier around the plant that buys us time. In the long term, in the 50 to 70 year time horizon, very likely that plant needs to get relocated. But that's a very long and expensive process. And so we view this as sort of multiple stages. So for now, putting in some improved protections at the sewer plant while we research and think about what the long-term solution is for relocating a sewer plant or connecting to treatment plants in our neighboring communities. None of the options are easy or inexpensive, so those will take years to do. Other similar things, sort of low-hanging fruit that we're pursuing, we again received some additional grant money for, is to, for example, various drains storm drains that empty out into the harbor, putting one-way gates on those. So basically flat valves that allow water to come out, but not seawater to come back up those drains and come out the storm drains in the street. A relatively simple measure that can help, again, forestall some of the flooding that could happen. And another exploration, and this is what we'll be talking about at the end of the month, is taking a look at Masconomo, the park there that's circled in the brownish tan color. How does that park perhaps get redesigned so that it can accommodate some of the higher rising seas and still function as an amenity for the town? So can it be modified in its design and layout to absorb higher waters and still provide the park amenities that we enjoy today. And so that will be an effort that our consultants will help us with at the end of the month, where we're doing a design charrette. We're asking folks to join us for a couple of days of walking around the park, looking at different features and seeing how it might get reoriented and redesigned. Maybe the parking that is now on the water side, on the waterfront, perhaps that goes back towards Beach Street on an elevated function. And you allow that existing parking area to absorb water. That becomes basically a lower lying area where water can pool and allow the water not to back up as far into Beach Street area and then up Tappan Street. It's all very interesting. So Masco and Tappan, those are all filled tidal lands. Those used to be mudflats. And Mother Nature is wanting to take that back. And so we may need to think about ways that we allow some of those areas to get reclaimed in longer term. So if we click to the next scenario, I'll skip over all the text. People can go to the text and read the details on your own. I'm not going to spend the time tonight going over all these details. There's again a lot of information here. But if we look at on this scenario 2, so this is this is the 30-year time frame. We're talking 2050, 2060s. What additional steps may be needed? So here we talk about potentially elevating buildings, potentially elevating roads. This is showing the possibility of elevating Beach Street. In Jayne's slide, it was showing that stretch that she's highlighting being underwater at 4 feet and definitely 6 feet of sea level rise. So does Beach Street get elevated and literally raised up? Not inexpensive, of course, but something that maybe we need to consider in the future. And then looking at Tappan Street, which is the brown area behind Masco, in that tan brown color. So again, do those buildings get elevated, or is there a longer term, is there a buyout program for those homeowners? Because that's an area that may not be viable come the turn of the century, 2100. Again, a long way off and a lot of discussion that has to take place to figure out how best to respond. But it's conversations that will need to take place in the not too distant future. And again, it's highlighting some of the town facilities, town hall, and then back up by Sawmill Brook, the Central Street Pond in that area. It highlights the fire station as a high-risk building. We already experienced flooding in the basement of the fire station when the Central Street Pond overtops its banks. We're doing some work with the culvert and restoring that as a free-flowing stream so that it'll have some extra capacity to absorb water during flood events. But it's not going to solve the 70-year problem of when we have even higher sea level rise. And again, showing areas that we may need to think about either buildings needing to be elevated or removed and becoming more of a floodable park area. So these are sort of the medium-term options. Do we elevate buildings? Do we try to create areas that can absorb waters to preserve other areas that protect it? And then if we click over to the third scenario, which is the longest time frame. So this is where we talk about even more extensive interventions. So here they're showing the possibility of the railroad tracks as being a raised structure that provides a much stronger barrier to rising waters from the ocean. So does that become the major protector of most of the village? Obviously, it's not protecting Masco and Tappan Street in that area, but it certainly is protecting everything north of the railroad tracks. And putting a gate then at the current crossing from the inner harbor to the rest of the harbor. Now that, again, very expensive. It requires significant cooperation, obviously, with MBTA, and they are going to have their hands full of lots of other priority projects all along their system. But again, we have time. This doesn't happen tomorrow. This is, again, on the 70-year time frame of thinking about how do we position ourselves for trying to protect and preserve a lot of these spaces. And it, again, showing some of the elevation of Beach Street and other buildings that are elevated and protected. And then sort of as an alternative to the long range scenario, and that's the last picture that I'll show here, is a whole different concept, right? Of not trying to protect it all, but letting a lot of this area revert back to what it was back in the 1800s, and that is, mudflats, and creating floodable areas to allow the water to go into these areas in order to protect the rest of the town. Again, not something we want to do tomorrow, and it's a long-term, very extensive conversations that will take decades to resolve. But it gets it on the table for discussion points and to get people thinking creatively about, well, what does a reimagined village interface with the harbor look like? May not be something we want to do, but it's something that is on the table to at least stimulate some conversations and to be thinking about where do we put new infrastructure down the road. So again, that water treatment plant, the sewer plant, in most scenarios needs a new home eventually. And where is that new home, and how do we start planning for that? Projects that take literally decades to accomplish. The finding space, the designing, the permitting, and getting the money. So even though we say we have 70 years, if it takes 20 to 25 years to find an ultimate solution, those timelines get more crunched. So it makes sense to start having these conversations and to start thinking about what are the possibilities and what are the options that may be before us. So I've jumped quickly from sort of the low-hanging fruit and those scenario one action steps that we can do easily today, blocking storm drains from not allowing water to go up in them, making Masco perhaps more amenable to absorbing some flooding and still allowing us to use it for a park, elevating our electrical panels, et cetera, and possibly waterproofing low-lying entrances into buildings. Those are things we can do today, and in the scheme of things are not that expensive. And then as we look further and further out, the scenarios get more complex and more challenging and certainly more costly. But they all require a lot of conversation and a lot of hard decision-making over time. So let me stop with that, because I really do want to save time for lots of give and take here. I encourage people to take a look at the plan, the full plan here, the vulnerability plan that we were able to put together. It is you can find it on our website under coastal vulnerabilities, and we'll be continuing to add to it as we look at other projects going forward. Jayne did mention the Central Street culvert and the sawmill restoration project. That'll finally be getting underway, not this fall, but the fall of 25. Now that is basically a 10-year process to do the studies, to do the engineering, and to secure about $7 million worth of grant funding to pay for all of that work. A major reconstruction of the old dam and culvert, and then restoring the banks of the Sawmill Brook and restoring it as a free-flowing tidal creek. So something that will be happening in a couple of years, hopefully to celebrate its completion. So things take time, and they take money, and it takes a lot of dialogue. And I look forward to having those conversations with folks tonight and going forward.
Thanks so much, Greg. We're going to open up the chat for Q&A. If you have a question, you can put it in the chat, or you can raise your hand by using the reactions. I think that's where you find it, or and under more. But you can raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question, and I'll call on you. Great. Well, we have one. Axel Magnuson, but I know that you're not Axel. You can unmute yourself and ask your question. Can you not unmute? Let's see.
Yeah, now I can. Thank you. Yeah, my name is Sylvia Friesenberg. I'm Axel's wife, but we're using his iPad. Thank you for this sobering but hugely informative, and I am so appreciative of all the work that has been put in this to help us prepare and not stick our hands in the sand, so to speak. I have a question for Greg about the rotunda. Given what I've just seen and heard, it seems to not make any sense to invest all these dollars that we're going to need for all these other big projects to invest in raising the rotunda. And I know one of the options proposed has been to put it on the land. And it seems to me, let's just, which I think is the least of the three options on the rotunda. So it seems to me to make sense to just put it on the land. And the people that are concerned about the, I guess the vistas and how it will look, from what I'm seeing with your scenarios, everything will change. All the looks and the way Manchester looks now is not going to be looking that way anyways. So why spend these precious dollars on things that that may not seem to matter anymore in some time?
No, I hear you, Sylvia, loud and clear. You know, that's the rotunda is such a beloved icon of the community that I think people have a hard time letting go of where it sits today. So as you alluded to, the preferred solution, proposed solution that gained the most traction is to raise it up about five feet or so in its current location. You know, so do we get another 20 years out of it? You know, that's a question mark. Depends on what size hurricane comes roaring through in the next 20 years. Barring a hurricane, it probably could survive 20 years, 5 feet higher than it is today, but no guarantee. And so it's to me, it's emblematic of the hard choices that people struggle to make. So we don't want to let go of what we have in the face of something that we can't fully imagine. And I think some of the value of the simulations that we were getting from Harvard, the mapping that Jayne was showing us this evening, is to help people start to visualize what these changes are going to be. I think that's slow to come. I think it takes a lot of repeating and letting people hear it. And we'll make some decisions that we look back on and said, why were we so short-sighted? And I think maybe the rotunda might be one of those.
Thank you.
Thanks, Greg. There's a question in the chat from Laura Kozacek. I think this is directed to Jayne. Can Singing Beach move with sea level rise? And could you say something about the problems with raising roads due to the fact that they become barriers even with culverts?
Okay, so the Singing Beach, I'm not from Manchester, so I probably am not the best person to answer that. Greg might be. But I would just say that beaches want to move with sea level rise and are capable of moving with sea level rise if they have a place to move to. If there's buildings and parking lots and things behind them, or road, for instance, that keeps the dune from moving and ultimately the beach from moving, then you will lose the beach. So, Long Beach is a situation in Rockport where they've built, where houses are built on the dune and there's a seawall. And so that beach is in danger of being lost because it cannot adjust to the rising sea levels. I'm not sure about Singing Beach. Greg, do you have comments on that?
So, 90% of Singing Beach is hemmed in. So there's a revetment along the backside of Singing Beach, and then a row of houses on top of the old dunes. So it does not have a path to retreat at the moment. The only path really would be the parking lot by the circle. And so that becomes a very, very different beach. If that's the only space that it would be allowed. And that raises a whole host of issues, right? I mean, those are very expensive premium properties that are along the backside of Singing Beach with those views of the ocean and being on the water. Is there the will and the funding to remove those structures and to create space for Singing Beach to retreat? And that's a huge question. And I don't have the answer sitting here today for that question. But that's a real challenge for Singing Beach in particular.
Thanks, Greg. Your other question is it possible to raise roads? Or Maureen, correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's another really difficult question. The obvious question that you have when you raise a road is, what about the houses that are serviced by that road, houses or businesses that are serviced by that road? If those houses and businesses that are serviced by that road are going to flood, then you end up with a road to nowhere, really. So, when you think about raising a road, you want to think about those issues. Are those houses going to be raised? Are those businesses going to be raised as well? Is it just the road that floods and not the properties? Another issue is, when you raise a road, are you just creating a dam for the water? Or do you raise a road and make it like a bridge so that the tidal waters and the storm waters can flow underneath the road? And of course, every road situation is unique, and you have to really evaluate each one individually based on many issues, really.
great. Thank you, Jane and Greg. Another question from the chat, and then Andy, I'll get to your question. Jane mentioned that sea level rise and storm surge, that you mentioned sea level rise and storm surge, but what about waves on top of the surge? Do we expect waves to get higher? And how far into the harbor would these waves reach?
Yeah, so certainly we're expecting storms to become more intense. Up in New England, we're really not expecting more hurricanes. Well, maybe that's not true. They're saying that the hurricanes are going to move further north, which I guess means that it's more might be coming here. But the thing that's really bad for us in this area is typically nor'easters. And the nor'easters they tend to last longer than a hurricane. When a hurricane comes up here, it's moving quite quickly. It moves in with a huge punch and then moves out very fast. A lot of times we get nor'easters that will last 2 tidal cycles, maybe 3 tidal cycles. And when the storm comes in and hits at the high tide, then you get, big damage. So the question of waves on top of storm surge, absolutely. The FEMA flood maps have a high velocity zone, which is supposed to take that into account. The FEMA flood maps are not really ideal right now because they don't consider sea level rise the way they should. I think the next version might, but you do have to take into account the energy of the high waves on top of the storm surge and the sea level rise. Obviously, that's very particular areas will be there'll be particular areas that are subject to the wave action, and other areas won't be.
Greg, do you want to
really.
add to that?
Well, just in terms of our harbor itself, so our worst case scenario is a southwest breeze, right? Or strong winds from the southwest. That's our exposure. We're well protected if it's a nor'easter in terms of our harbor, in terms of waves. But if that hurricane is coming with a southwesterly push, that's when it could enter into our harbor pretty easily, because that's our opening. That opening faces southwest. So it really depends on the direction of the storm in terms of how far into the harbor do those higher waves reach.
Great. Andy, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Sure, yeah, I have a question for Jayne and then a comment. So I'm looking at your slide, likely levels of sea level rise in Boston, and it says 1 foot likely by 2030. So that's 6 years away. Are you saying that sea level rise will rise a foot in the next 6 years, or was that 1 foot calculated from an earlier date?
That was calculated from the year 2020, 1 foot above what it was in 2020.
Wow, that's a lot. I don't know what Boston is going to do with all the water. So the next thing I wanted to say is it's really just a comment, and I want to get your opinion. You mentioned the historic crests in Boston Harbor, going back to the winter storm of 1978, which was about 46 years ago. And 4 of the, you showed 7 crests, historic crests. And 4 of those crests, the highest crest, were in the last 6 years. So 4 out of the 7 were in the last 6 years. You want to comment on that? Why is that? And what are we seeing? I mean, that that says something.
Yeah, that essentially speaks for itself. That's what we're saying. Sea levels are rising. Sea level rise, the rate of sea level rise is accelerating. Your first question was, are we going to see that much sea level rise in that short a time? And yes, with the accelerating pace of sea level rise, we are. That's what the projections say. So that we're seeing it. We're seeing big flooding events in the last 6 years that are greater than some of the biggest storms of the century.
And is this a direct result of the rising temperatures?
Yes.
Okay.
It is, and that's because sea surface temperatures have been rising. The atmospheric temperatures have been rising, but if you really focus on the sea surface temperatures, the temperature of the ocean, when you get a warmer ocean, it expands and it takes up more space, and that's one of the reasons that we're getting sea level rise, along with the melting of glaciers and ice in Antarctica and land ice in Antarctica and Greenland.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jayne. Thanks for your question, Andy. I have a question for Greg. That flooding in Manchester was, I would say, shocking in January, and the pictures in the paper, the reporting about it, we all saw it. We drove around and looked online. What were people in Manchester saying? What was the pulse of the community after that? January storm, what were some of the discussions or the questions or issues that were raised at that time?
Yeah, I think a lot of it was sort of like wow, I've never seen that before. And wow, we really have some challenges here, don't we? So I think it was a vivid example of the changes that are happening, and a motivator for people to say, yeah, we really do need to be paying attention and need to put resources into figuring out strategies that we can accept. Sylvia brought up the debate over the rotunda. I mean, in the scheme of things, that's a pretty minor piece of infrastructure in terms of life supporting. It's a wonderful icon and people cherish it. But in terms of, an essential piece of infrastructure, no. And yet we struggle with even that decision making, right? So it just what happened in January, coupled with our example of the emotional struggles we have of making some of those hard choices, as exemplified by the rotunda, point to the work we have ahead of us and the need to roll up our sleeves and get busy.
Thanks, Greg. I want to encourage our participants to ask questions in the chat, or just please raise your hand and I will call on you. That's usually the easiest way for me to see you. You'll move to the front of the gallery and I can see you that way. I'd like to bring Sarah Page into the conversation. Sarah, and also engage Jayne and Greg in this question too. You mentioned like a sea gate at a couple of different places in Manchester Harbor. Of course, that is a really expensive option, but we're talking about likelihoods here. Is that a likely infrastructure piece that could be considered in Manchester, or is that something that would not be considered? I know, Greg, you mentioned the railroad bridge as a potential barrier, but I just wanted to, it's very interesting, there's not a lot of places on Cape Ann that could take a barrier like that. So what are some thoughts about that?
Yeah, thanks, Maureen. I think that as both Greg and Jayne both pointed out, that the internal gate is a little bit more feasible than the larger harbor gate that's further out, just because part of our original estimates were showing that like totaling of several of the structures, so the cost of the infrastructure versus how many physical buildings are being protected. But I think even just running that scenario gives us an idea of comparison. So having that as a starting point can aid in these conversations, kind of how Greg is discussing it at the rotunda scale, but then also at the opposite side of it, like let's look at these like major infrastructures. But having these two scales to work on can help us find something within the center.
Great,
Yeah,
thanks, Sarah. Comments?
We're underway with a harbor master plan, harbor management plan, and one of the topics we'll be taking a look at that outer barrier. There's a real question as to its permittability. I think that's a major question mark, whether or not Army Corps and the state would, through Chapter 91, whether or not they would even entertain such a structure. And then, how big do you make it, right? So you anticipate the 10-foot hurricane surge, but then the hurricane that actually hits has a 15-foot wave that comes barreling right over it. So you spent your tens of millions and yet it didn't do what it was supposed to do. So there's lots of questions to try to answer.
Yeah,
I think another thing to consider, oh, I'm sorry, Jayne, go ahead.
I was just going to say, make one comment that I'm very impressed with Greg and his team here in Manchester for the work that you have done in in thinking about these issues and trying to plan for the future. There are many communities all up and down the coast who are behind, mainly because they're not sure what to do. And I think Manchester is a leader in that regard and could be an example for other coastal communities. I just want to give a little shout out for that. But in answer to your question, not in answer to your question, a comment about your question, Maureen, and kind of a question for you, Greg, is it seems like the railroad bridge would be a perfect place for a storm surge gate, except for one thing. And
The
that
water running that goes out.
well, if you're blocking the water from going in, then you're going to be flooding other areas on the outside.
Yeah.
So there would have to be some kind of storage,
Right.
accommodation for that extra water. Because you're not only not letting the water going into the inner harbor and beyond, you're also got the sea level rise, so all that extra water outside of the gate. But I don't know.
Yeah, and that's
Questions.
even with the outer gate idea, water's going to circle back around on the Beverly Manchester line and come barreling down the railroad tracks and flood by the backside of Tuck's Point on the inside of that gate. So yeah, you squeeze one area and it forces it in another spot.
Well, New Bedford has a nice gate
Yes.
To look at, and they obviously have that open most of the time, and then just close it for bad events.
Right. And then, but there's the problem of all that water coming down Sawmill Brook, and where it wants to dump into that inner harbor, and it wants to keep going out. And if we've got a gate, it's not going out. So how do you manage that? Because typically you've got huge rainfall coming down at the same time that you have a storm surge.
Right.
So that's all problematic.
Thanks. Sarah, did you have another comment?
I was just gonna say, and like thinking about all these alternatives, another thing is thinking about what it means. We're planning for this future storm event and for the worst case scenario, but there's also something to consider, which is the 99% of the time that doesn't lead up to that. So like, what does it mean to have this large ecological barrier? Even if it is open, the majority of the time it will have an impact. And then also, how does that impact how the harbor is used and utilized? So there are also things to consider.
Great. Thanks for those comments. Laura Tenney, you have your hand raised.
Thanks, Maureen. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Thanks to the panelists for a terrific presentation tonight, and echo praise of Greg and the job that you all have been doing. I'd love to hear more about the Masconomo plans for the floodable park, but I also have a couple of comments. I really appreciated, Sarah, what you just said about the ecological functions and remembering, what the green economy and the nature-based systems that we have the potential to harness here, and what it's like to live with these interventions the rest of the time when it's not flooding. So I think that's a great point to remember that the ecological criteria should be high on our list to protect. And one observation that I want to make about the MVP plan that Manchester has done, I sat in a little bit of it towards the final end of the plan, and what impressed me about it, other than the technical aspects of the plan, but how much of that vulnerable land is actually owned and controlled as municipal land, strikes me as a great opportunity to think about the longer term solutions. Because while there is a good amount of private land that and some of it residential that needs serious consideration, there is also all these municipal lands where the sewer system and the town hall and the police and all these functions are. So it strikes me that that could enable some longer term planning. And also, as we think about our other municipal lands on higher ground, that the future of those ought to be part of this exercise too, about where are we going to move these things to, and starting to study those now, and kind of, to the extent you can kind of set aside things at a planning level. to account for those. And then the one other point I would make about that plan is that I think the scenario one, where you can do the kind of low hanging fruit, not a huge cost investment, not terribly disruptive, that is, we should be going ahead and doing those, but then going stepwise from level 1 to level 2 to level 3, I would encourage us all to think about level 3 and not just going stepwise through level 2 and 3, because a lot of the money that you invest in level 2 may not lead to those kinds of solutions that you want to live with all the time, and maybe money that investment that you undo at level 3. So I think it's not just like a sort of stepwise thing. It's actually, what's the low hanging fruit, and then what should we start to prioritize out of the longer term solutions, the level 3. And then just to go back to my question, I'd love to hear more about the planning that's happening for Masconomo Park. And I'll stop there. Thank you all.
Thanks, Laura, and thank you for your work that you do on the planning board and helping out with that vulnerability plan. Much appreciated. So the desire is to hold some public forums and this whole design charrette at the end of April. April 30th will be the first one, and then following 2 days later. So the team will assemble. The consulting team will assemble with the public on April 30th to walk the park and just talk about different concepts and different ideas to see which ones might resonate. They'll take some of that feedback from that initial field trip and discussions, and on day 2 work up some ideas and some concepts, and then on day 3 reconvene the public to hear some of their thoughts in terms of how they translated the ideas into possible plans and sketches, and then we share those sketches with the public on day 3 to see again which ones seem to resonate with the public the most, in an effort to come up with sort of plan A and plan B as the most desirable ones that we can work with and think about again long-term changes to Masconomo as we want to have it be more resilient to sea level rise. So that'll be coming up. We'll be publicizing that towards the end, as the month advances here, and let people know about that, and look forward to people's input on it. I certainly appreciate the thought that we're doing a lot of work in Manchester, but it feels like we're just beginning, and it feels like the community dialogue really needs to ramp up and go to a higher level. I think we've got a good foundation for that. We've got a lot of good materials. What Sarah has been able to produce from Harvard, that I think is a very, very strong foundation for us. The work that we've been able to do with that, with the support of Senator Tarr and some state funding, has been greatly appreciated. It enables us to lay this foundation. But we've got a lot of community dialogue and soul searching and work to do. It feels like just the beginning.
Thanks so much for that overview, Greg. Where can people get more information?
So certainly we'll be publicizing the charrette on the website, and we have that coastal vulnerability page on the front page that people can click on. So go to the manchester.ma.us is our website, and they can find that, and we'll certainly be putting out information through our social media and the Cricket. We use the Cricket as our weekly paper to communicate with folks in town frequently.
We have Jayne Knott raising her hand for a question.
I just wanted to say to Laura that, Laura, you made a great point about the stepwise approach. A stepwise approach is a great approach, but you want to make sure that the steps that you take don't have to be undone. So you have to do a stepwise approach, always looking to that future, and choose the options that are going to be compatible with the actions of the future. So that's a great point. That's all I wanted to say.
Great. Thank you. Any final question? We have just one with a quick response as we're coming up on the 8 o'clock hour. Laura Kozacek talks about real estate values changing, especially such as Nantucket, the price tag for protection from the ocean is high. A recent example in Salisbury. These stories are national and international news. How long will the short-term economics be the focus? Anybody want to take that?
It's a good question. I don't have, my crystal ball is pretty cloudy on and trying to answer that one. But it, you know, our whole tax base in Manchester, for example, is very much geared to, you know, those high-priced coastal homes, paying the bulk of our tax base, representing the bulk of our tax base. So if we were to lose those high-end homes, that would be a huge change in the whole economic dynamic of the town. So another piece of the puzzle that's a challenge to deal with. So how do we get people to look longer term? Hopefully conversations like this. So.
Wonderful, great. Well, I want to thank our panelists this evening, Dr. Jayne Knott, Sarah Page from the Harvard Graduate School Design's Office for Urbanization, and Greg Federspiel, for all your insights and the information that you've shared with us this evening. This webinar is being recorded, and we will also have the slide deck that was presented this evening on our website. That's towngreen2025.org, and you can look under the webinar menu item, and it will show you videos. We also have a section on the website for just Manchester by the Sea. I want to remind everyone that we are having a field trip this Friday, April 5th. We will meet at 3 o'clock at Masconomo Park. We are going to have Barbara Warren with us from Salem Sound Coast Watch to walk us through Masconomo Park. Then we intend to drive to Singing Beach and take a look at that area as well. Barbara is very well and very knowledgeable about the issues in Manchester by the Sea. So it will be a great guided field trip. If you have enjoyed our webinar series, please visit our website, consider making a donation, and also follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and sign up for our newsletter for the most up-to-date information. And on behalf of everyone at TownGreen, many, many thanks to Tom Meekus for being the tech person, and to all of you again for participating in this website. Thank you and have a lovely evening.
Good night.
Thank you, Maureen.